Starting rent to rent can feel overwhelming. What if I lose money? What if agents say no? What if it doesn't work for me? But here's the reality. Those fears are actually signals, pointing you towards the exact skills that you need to build to succeed. In this video, I'm breaking down the most common fears holding rent-to-renters back and how to turn them into actionable steps to maintain your confidence and momentum. So you've come across rent-to-rent, and as a vehicle for passive income, it's interested you, you're excited, but I'm guessing you've got question marks and there's probably a bit of fear, and that's what I want to address just now. Because let's say this is you and you're thinking that this model is spot on, but then you start to ask questions about how does the model work? Is it legal? What's the time commitment? What systems do I need to be in place? Maybe contracts. Great. And you wouldn't be wrong, because thousands of mentees that we've helped succeed have all had three areas in particular of fear. And I think if I were just to break them down for you, generally speaking, to get to the deals, plural, and the cash flow, the first thing you need to do is make sure that you can overcome the fear of just getting started and just getting set up. So I'll dive a bit deeper, but bear with me. I'm just going to call this LTD because that's the business. And you've got to get that bit right, but that's the leap of faith. And the unknown aspect of that leap is really where that fear comes from. So I want to make sure we address that. Second of all, there is fundamentally lack of knowledge. There's stuff that you would know having done a deal that you don't know now, but you've got to get there. And I'm not saying that that's easy. Rent-to-rent's simple. It's not easy. And between now and then, some of the stuff you have to do is hard, but that's why it's worth doing, right? So I want to address this lack of knowledge, fear as well. And finally, there's a pretty big question mark with regards to the logistics of doing a deal. What if it goes wrong? What if it doesn't work? What about my area? So I want to make sure we address these, because if you don't, the fear will be crippling and you would never find yourself in a position where the deal and the cash flow would be yours. So let's crack on. I mentioned the fear around getting started, and I called it LTD because in reality that's the first step you take beyond recognizing the model is going to be great for you as a vehicle for income, passive or otherwise. So let's just start with it there. Let's get started. And speaking of limited companies, there is an issue that I've come across with mentees in the past at this stage on its own, because there is an element of knowledge around the setup and how you structure the business and the trading names that you're going to employ, be it landlord, guest facing, because remember that matters, as does the branding. But what about your SIC codes? Have you appropriated them in line with your business model? Operation of owned and leased real estate, for example, here. And that's what we're doing. So I think in terms of that, if I were to give you a solution today, super simple. Go check the link below to get this set up checklist. It's helped thousands of people. So set up checklist. Go download it, crack on. It's got everything you need to know. Now, really, really important here. I hear this a lot from mentees. I'm just going to abbreviate this to friends and family. But in reality, it can be acquaintances too. And there's the judgment around starting something new. And of course, this doesn't have to be the context of rent-to-rent and property problem solving that we do, but it does happen. You might not have your friends on board. You might not have your family supporting you. And of course, it would be great if they were, and then it wouldn't be a problem. But often people either don't believe in you and your ability to operate the model, or they don't believe in the model itself. I would just have a little think about whether or not the people advising you around this have been there and done it, because presumably you would only really want to take advice from people who have been there. and the track record's pretty good. So I think just frame that around the solve, which for me, one of the biggest pieces of this journey for our mentees is community. Find yourself a group of like-minded people, half of which are doing better than you and half of which that you can help. That's a really, really nice place to find yourself. Feels good to help others, right? So community is super key. Lots of places to get started in there, and I'm sure you know where to get the help. So final piece within this getting started, and again, comes up a lot, and it's purely self-belief. And this is so big because the solve isn't as simple as put a plaster on it. But let me talk you through a process here. A lack of self-belief might be based on previous interactions with challenge, but no matter where you started and where you're at now, look how far you've come. Look at the adversity you've overcome. Because I think if you have a little look at what you've achieved already, you've probably overcome mountains and hurdles that far exceed you doing some viewings and talking to some landlords. Am I right? I'd like to think so. So if that's the case, one thing you can do to control this aspect, because there is a fear of failure element here and an ego protection part too, which I will cover. But for me, it's all about goals. And the best way to control around getting started in rent to rent here is to set yourself really, really firm but high level goals. Make sure they're in line with the time you have available. But if I were to just throw some figures at you just now, we recommend people do 3 viewings per week. And statistically within our community of support and the one-to-one mentee support that we offer, we expect the first deal to come after, I think it's 11.5 viewings if we were to split hairs. Well, that means once you've done your setup and you've established your community and you're in your feedback loop and you're doing everything legally and you've got your contracts in place, then your goal should be a handful of viewings for a handful of weeks. And as long as you're improving each time, statistically, as soon as you get to double digits, that's where the deal lies. I'd like to think that self-belief around you setting your goals around achieving that would result in success. So bear that in mind moving forward. Now, I mentioned lack of knowledge, and I put that as a big fat question mark before for good reason, because when you get started, you probably don't know everything you need to. I think that's reasonable. But the fear comes from not knowing what happens next, and then what, and then what. So if we were just to begin with my question mark and why it exists at this stage, because you've got landlords, you've got agents, you've maybe got your area, you've maybe got aspects of the contracts, you've maybe even got an element of imposter syndrome. You know, do you believe that you are a £1 million property investor? And of course, there's an element of fake it till you make it kind of thing. But I want to identify one particular part of this journey where the fear really sets in, and it's to do with viewings. In particular. And there's a consultative model that I think makes it really, really simple. So let's try and break it down using this then. So the first thing I want to address is on the viewing, you've got one job really, and it's to say yes. And how the yes lands is based on what I'm about to show you here. So there's this element of building trust, and I like to describe rapport building as part of this process. But remember, you want to be likable, and you want to make sure you attend on time, and you want to make sure that you put your best foot forward. Great. So maybe you're great at that bit already. The next part of this consultative model is when speaking to that landlord, you're going to have to identify their needs, where they are in the process. Got to identify their needs. Every landlord will be different. Every agent conversation will be different. And that's why we need to ask great questions. And I'm going to highlight some of these segments that overlap here when we do this next. Once you've identified needs, it's really, really important that you put on your problem-solving hat and you tailor a solution around that. So we've got this offer solutions aspect here. And of course, you want it to be a win-win, and it will be if you crunch your numbers properly. So if you can offer your solution, you want to make sure you do that in a nice, coherent way. And that leads to probably the scariest part, because this is hopefully where you're going to say yes, which is a barrel of laughs often, because you really are jumping in the deep end here. But let me tell you why that's fine. So hopefully this will be a close and you can say yes. And I talked about those segments before, didn't I? So let me just build these out here. So get the colors out. This is rapport. Super important. And I like to think of these being almost the lubricant between the stages. And really, really important here. This is where your questioning comes into play. Super important. A number of key questions I love to ask on a viewing in terms of previous management, what the previous tenants were like, the landlord situation. Have they got time to do this and that? And on the back of that, notice the colours are going from green, amber, and to red. That's because the risk of doing this stuff increases as you go, but that's where the money is. That's why we go there. And this final piece here, really for me, is about confidence. There we go. Now I want to talk a little bit more about this yes piece, because I said that this is a little rabbit warren of its own. And a lot of people question why we recommend to our mentees to do this. Let me tell you, we're all about mitigating risk and we want maximum reward for our time. And once you're at the end of the viewing, and whether the numbers stack or not doesn't really matter. All that matters is you built the trust using your rapport skills. You identified the needs because you asked great questions. You offered a solution. You did it with confidence. You said yes. Worst case scenario is the landlord's not interested. Agent says no, but your offer still landed. Like the number's still in their head. The 2,500 monthly rent guaranteed with all the other stuff you offer in terms of length of term and all that good stuff is still there. Dollar signs will have been seen. Your hope is that they bought in alongside your offer. And you were great at arguing at that point because there's a bit of pushback, and we'll talk about contracts as well. But saying yes rather than a maybe, which is where a lot of people go, maybe it's just a polite way of saying no. So saying yes, whether you know for sure or not that you want that deal, is really, really powerful. Because if it came to it, and having crunched the numbers, and you referred it to experts, and you made sure that the numbers did stack, then yes works, doesn't it? Because you send over your offer in writing, and heads of terms and contracts would follow. But let's say that it didn't work. Let's say that big sad face, no bueno, deal doesn't work. You've just said yes to the landlord, haven't you? So what happens then? Well, in the same way that any business transaction works, if you hadn't said yes, he wouldn't have listened. The fact you said yes means that he did. And if you were to go back to that landlord a day later and apologize and say that really we're looking for a different type of property, have you got anything else on the market? Well, now I've maintained my professional relationship, the integrity I built throughout the trust, identifying the needs, offering a solution and closing. I've built my persona, my integrity around that process. Well, I've still maintained that, and said, have you got any other properties on the market that are maybe bigger? Maybe it was a 3-bed, and I was really, really sorry, John. The landlord's always called John in my mind. Really, really sorry, John. My client's really looking for a 3-bed. I don't suppose, really looking for a 4-bed. I don't suppose you've got a 4-bed on the market. 3 is a little bit too small, unfortunately. I've referred to my clients. And those are the clients you're going to be working with in reality. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that removes the need for any fear at the saying yes stage, and simple process for building trust, identifying those needs, offering solutions, and then really, really going for the close at that stage. So the viewing was a big part of that question mark, but so was fear of failure. And let's be honest, not every landlord or agent you speak to is going to be on board. I think that's a reality, and that's something that we work with, and with knowledge of, we can adapt. And it's really, really important that we put this stuff into perspective. So if we just go with just fear of failure, big title. Now there's a couple circles going on here. And for me, the most simple way to look at the process, because rejection is a reality. With everything worth doing, it tends to be difficult, right? And I'm not trying to sugarcoat this. You are going to be making attempts. It might be in a networking environment. It might be on a viewing. It might be with your first joint venture. It might be a management opportunity. Whatever it is, there's going to be attempts. And there's only a number of outcomes of an attempt, because it can either work or it doesn't. And this is kind of what I want to make sure that you're on board with, because if, for example, your attempt were to fail, and we've already described that as being a possibility, there is a bit of a cycle here, because if you were to attempt and experience failure, what would you probably need to do next? Now, you've got security in knowing the model works. Thousands of people before you have done this and succeeded, and if they can, why not you? In which case, on the back of the failure, you would make another attempt. Hopefully, you're still on board. Eventually, though, with those attempts, and I'm going to break down the Kirkpatrick model with you in a second as to what you do between these aspects here. But eventually, statistically, it is more than probable that you would find yourself in a place of success, and we can be super happy. And then you get your deal and the dollar signs, and that's where we want to be. But there's a big part of this process in between, and that's where the learning takes place. So I want to go one layer deeper on this now and make sure that you're responding to feedback, you know how to learn from your experiences, because remember, you can never go backwards in this game. Every viewing, every interaction, whether it goes well or not, is a learning experience. And remember, you learn far more from the mistakes you make than the wins. So on the back of that, I mentioned the Kirkpatrick model. It doesn't matter what it's called. It just matters how we're going to use it here. And in our context of rent-to-rent viewings, property opportunities and property problem solving, be it serviced accommodation, HMO, social housing, supported living, maybe even a management opportunity, we need to respond appropriately. So if I were to start by, the previous process had failure and success and the attempts you made. Let's say that your attempt resulted in a no, and we have to frame that rejection, let's call it. So if we were to start with your reaction to that taking place, okay? How you react determines the integrity that you brought to the situation and what you're going to do next. So let's say the landlord said no. Let's play the hypothetical. If you were to run home crying about it, you probably wouldn't see a lot of benefit. However, if your immediate reaction is to be understanding, John, totally understand. I don't suppose if this were to be different, we would be working together further down the line. Or I know that you're not interested in this model today, John, but it seems like you have a tenancy issue. If I were able to provide you with tenants, is that something you'd find useful? So the conversation can continue. But the first thing we need to make sure we do is we have to learn from the process. Super, super important. And the learning often falls into a realm of, can I attribute that success internally or externally? Same with the failure. And if you walk away with that, having thought deeply about the questions, did you go 3 layers deep in asking about the previous tenants? Did you ask the landlord what he would rather be doing with his time? Asking questions, people love talking about themselves. And did you get a chance to do that enough? Because often that's not the case. So as we transition here and you engage in that learning, give yourself feedback. That's why it's great to do this with a community, with a team, with people you can bounce ideas off and be a soundboard. So if we can frame the learning here, then what we really want to make sure we do next, and let me pick a really nice color here, is we want to talk about what our behavior is like next. Because if we get this bit wrong, we're definitely going to lose. Now, questioning is something that comes up often. But a big part here people talk about, and a lot of my mentees have fear in this area, is they're not entirely sure what went wrong and they're not entirely sure what needs improving. Categories that normally come up are around contracts and the questions that landlord and agents have around a company-let contract or a management agreement or a lease agreement. And there's lots of terminology used and lots of mistakes get made. And how you present that to yourself and the learning you can take away from it is absolutely vital, because if you get it right, guys, if you get it right, you can imagine what this result's going to look like. Because this wasn't us feeling sorry for ourselves. This was us being proactive about how we can do it better next time. Because if you weren't able to answer a question, surely you would make sure you can answer that question next time. So if it was about the management agreement and they asked about your rights to allow another party to manage it alongside you, for example, fairly complicated stuff. If you weren't able to answer that question on the spot, you've only got 2 choices. You either say you don't know, well, actually 3 maybe. You don't know, you lie and make it up, or you ask for some more detail. John, great question. What do you mean by that, for example? Or, great question, John. What are you thinking? Because if you're able to respond like that and you do that next time, then you're more likely to get the result you're looking for. So I think, like I said, I can't attribute this anywhere other than the Kirkpatrick model. But in terms of how you respond to any of the rejection you might experience along the process of the viewing, how you react to it, how you engage with your community, soundboard ideas, the result you're looking for, and that deal at the end of the line is what you're going to get. Now, this lack of knowledge aspect is really interesting for me, and I've talked about attributing failures and successes internally, externally. That's whether or not you blame yourself or something you couldn't control, like the weather, for example. And there's an element of ego protection as well. Bear with me. So what I'm going to try and describe here is, I think for me, it's the feeling of being put on the spot. And the reason that's so important is that's where we feel anxiety. That's where we feel unsure and your blood pressure rises, you start sweating and you get asked difficult questions, and that's when you feel uncomfortable and you're not going to perform at your best. And hopefully you can all relate to that. You've maybe been put on the spot. A great thing is a school-related scenario where you get asked a question you definitely don't know the answer to, and you've got 30 people all like turning and looking, waiting for the answer, and you don't know it. That's an uncomfortable place to be. And I think for me, this happens often with the mentees we work really closely with at the beginning of their journey, and there's a number of ways we make sure that they're in a place of confidence when this happens. So preparation's obviously the key to success here, but there's a performative part too. So if I were to break this down here, Lots of people are advocates of having scripts. And learn to spell. Scripts are great. You've got to make them your own. So as long as you've got rough guidance on what you should say to a landlord and what you shouldn't. For example, I would never recommend using the words short term when talking to a landlord. Because if a landlord's generally used to having ASTs in place, long-term tenants, the passive income version, short-term doesn't really correlate with that mindset. So there's something you just wouldn't say. And conversely, you would probably talk more about medium and long-term stays because they're the contractors we work with. And that's what allows us to generate the margins that we're going to get, right? So scripts are great, but you know what's better is when you're put on the spot, knowing that what you're saying comes from a place of integrity. What I mean by that is you have to believe in the model. And that's why the question marks I put at the beginning of this session were about, does the model work? Will it work for me? Is it legal? Once you understand all of that stuff, then when you're asked a question and you're answering with absolute integrity because you know that what you offer is a solution to a landlord's problem, it's a win. It can be a win-win-win-win, technically, because your guest gets a great stay, you take the profits for your hard work and efforts, the agent gets their percentage, and the landlord still gets paid the rent. It's guaranteed, right? So scripts are key, and you want to develop your own. Of course, there are places to go and seek those. But fundamentally, if you understand the model, then the fear around maybe not having it word for word doesn't matter so much. Now, in addition to that, I want to make sure that we also get a grasp of the other main aspect where questioning from landlords and agents throws people. Because I mentioned before, you could say, I don't know, but there are better things to say than that. Contracts. Mentioned it briefly already, but what's really, really key is to know that you've got the right contracts and you're not winging it. Because anybody can set up a limited company, I think you'd agree. The barrier to entry there is really low. And with a developer on Fiverr, you can get a website done and you could follow suit from examples online. And that's all great, but that's not the same as having the right legal documentation to protect yourself as well as the other party, maybe the landlord in this case. Having those contracts in place gives you such confidence. You can even take contracts on viewings with you. So in terms of having a spotlight on you and what you're doing on a viewing and an interaction with a landlord agent, etc., knowing you have the right contracts in place is a great place to speak without scripts. You bring integrity and you know that legally you're covered. Now, finally, I want to make sure that we're really, really clear about my favorite part here, which is data. Because the fake it till you make it aspect won't always help you overcome imposter syndrome, but what will is reps. And the more landlords you've spoken to and the more networking you've done and the more you've worked closely with your community and anybody that's maybe leading on your journey who's done this before, the more likely you are to speak from a position of confidence because data suggests that you've done it. You've been asked that question before. You've been here before. It's just like, it's a walk in the park now. And I've got a saying I use with my mentees all the time is, I want to see 10 viewings under their belt before I think they're good. At that stage, you've probably heard every question you can get asked, statistically the most likely ones. So then you've got a data set on which to base the spotlight. And it doesn't matter that you've got it on you because you've already answered those questions before and you can do so again with confidence. Squeaky bum time. I like to call this the worst case scenario. What better place to address fear than looking at the worst thing that could go wrong in the scenario of our first rent-to-rent deal? Because that's where our mentees struggle the most, actually. And I've described a part of this process already, so let's just revisit that quickly. And that's where you say yes. And remember, No fear around the yes. It's great positioning. It's your integrity. So rewatch that bit of the video if you want clarity again. But once you've said yes and the deal is yours, fantastic, great work. Lots of logistics, lots of systems, lots of automations, lots of OTAs, lots of listings, fine, cleaning, there's bits and pieces with the council, etc. But let's say that fundamentally this property doesn't make you any money. You can't find tenants. No one wants to live there. It doesn't work on usual OTAs, and the nightly rate doesn't stack, and your break-even percentage is crazy high, and it was just a poor deal. Now, you'd never have done this deal in the first place, but remember, we're role-playing the worst-case scenario here. So you get into this deal, and this is where contracts I mentioned previously are so important, because if you did use the wrong contracts, let's say you use ChatGPT to come up with the management agreement for you. And I know some of you have done this. Please don't. But if you were to do that, key clauses would be missed. And on the back of doing that, you'd be far more liable at this stage. But let's say you used the right stuff and you did it properly and it's just a bad deal. Immediately, things would go wrong and you'd be guaranteeing rent that you can't afford. So bear with me as we sort of... we end up in a situation where you realize that the bills are out of control. You realize that the first payment dates, like your effective date and first payment date, are super close together, and you owe the landlord imminently, and you've not generated cash flow from the property at all. So what happens here? Remember, worst case scenario. Well, if you got the contracts right, you would know what to do, because you would already have had a termination clause locked in that management agreement with this landlord, or in the case of a company let equally. So that's when you would know to pull the trigger on it. And remember, worst case scenario. So if you were to do that here and you were to pull the trigger, you would need to do a couple of things. And if you didn't, then I guess financial ruin would ensue. But if you got this bit right and used the right contracts, which obviously I'm insisting that you do, please, then the first thing that would happen is that you would crush your pricing. Okay? And what I mean by that is you've hopefully tried to make the deal work at a place where it's profitable. No one's staying in this particular scenario because presumably the pricing or the location is wrong. Now, the only way to overcome that is to crush your pricing to a point where it is price penetration. Because remember, all you got to do is secure that rent. Now, of course, you might take a hit in the meantime, but we need to maintain some buoyancy with our funds. So if you can crush pricing and get to that point where you can afford the next rental, then with our contract, we've got a 2-month termination. So at this point, you've only got to get through 2 months. What do you think you're going to do in those 2 months? Exactly. My favorite motto, always be sourcing. So in those 2 months that you crushed your pricing, you would get back out into the market. Backs against the wall. You've got to source another deal. And you know why? Because if you get that right, then all that furniture that was in the previous property gets moved over. Because remember, those items, soft furnishings and otherwise, are a business expense. Your business owns those. They're not property expenses. You didn't leave them in the property over here, did you? It's not the paint on the wall. Okay? At which point you can just move your business assets into another property. At which point, hopefully you did crunch your numbers properly this time, and this one will generate you the cash flow you need. So hopefully you can see that worst case scenario, even if it was an awful deal, so long as you use the right contracts and you get to this stage where, to crush pricing, to get back onto the sourcing train and then move your furniture over. Because I put money on the fact you could find another deal in 2 months, having already done one. It's great positioning. So just to recap on that, first thing was contracts. Second thing I mentioned was crush your pricing. And finally, move your furniture on. Now, for clarity, when I said worst case scenario, I genuinely mean that. And interestingly, it's not a scenario that we've ever needed to experience with any of our mentees. So I have really pushed it out there and come up with what I think could only be the worst case scenario. And with the right contracts, price crush and moving your assets over, then you would avoid this and you would find yourself back at the top. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're saying, Guy, you talked about this, you talked about that, but in reality, I just want to know if it works in my area. Now, that's a big question, requires a lot of numbers, but I'd like to address the fears around that question in particular. So for me, I want to address it in 4 ways. Firstly, let me ask you a question, and that is where you're based, wherever you are. We'll use the UK as an example here, but technically this is a global problem in terms of fear. My question to you would be, as you look around, as you drive around, as you walk the dog, as you look on Google Maps, statistically, it is likely that there's room for 1, 2, 3, 10 more well-run, well-delivered, well-dressed, well-listed properties. Be that from a serviced accommodation perspective, an HMO perspective. I would implore you to consider that option when the question, the fear in your head is, I don't think it works in my area, because I think you'll find that it probably does. Is there room for another? Remember, it's got to be top drawer, just like there's a new box of cereal in the cereal aisle every week, but it's probably not rubbish. So high level, great contracts in place, well dressed, well run, great automations, great guest tenant communication, all that stuff done well. Is there room for another one? I think you'd agree it's probably a yeah. Now, in addition to this, we're in a scenario in this country in particular, but a lot of the Western world is experiencing a similar thing. And that's the point that housing is a seriously core need. Wherever you look, there is room for more accommodation of some sort. The stats speak for themselves. And although houses are being built at an increasing rate, it's not at a rate fast enough to solve for the problem. And with housing being a core need, and we're property problem solvers, right? There's, of course, an area for us to employ our skills to fill that gap. And the landlords need help, the agents need help, tenants need a place to stay, and people travel. So housing's a core need, guys. Don't forget that when you're considering this problem and the fear around area. I mentioned landlords briefly then, didn't I? So let's address that too. With landlords, use my red one for this. I think lots have changed for landlords in the last couple governmental terms, and you've maybe heard the Renters Reform Bill or Renters' Rights Bill mentioned recently as well. And lots of these changes, Section 24, just how landlords' profits have been squeezed and the regulation in terms of safety for tenants. And these are all often moving in the right direction for making sure accommodation is of a certain standard. And I think we all agree that's a good thing. But that being said, the landlord profit margins are being squeezed and they're the worst they ever have been right now. That's an opportunity for us as rent-to-renters, because if tenants become more risky and our contracts still stipulate guaranteed rent for a certain term, a fixed term, which is what we do, remember, and we offer an element of cosmetic refurb and cleaning between tenants, guests, etc., and we take on all of that management, then we become a pretty important part of solving that landlord problem. So I'm just going to put landlords struggling for dollar signs here, or GDP here. And I think we can step in and solve that problem regardless of where you're at. Now, Final piece for this one. Wherever you are, it's likely that you will have, it's an American saying, right? There's riches in niches. Obviously, we would pronounce it niches. But guys, go find your niche. I've just got so many examples. A mentee that's near Harry Potter World is a great example. But it doesn't have to be a guest magnet like that. There are plenty parts of the country that could well be on your doorstep, and you just need one. It's great to have lots, but you just need one. And you maybe have not considered that option yet, because if you get that right and you dial that in, fear goes out the window and the deal's going to work for you. So hopefully you found that useful too.